This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. In this episode, we're going to talk water, and I have two people who play in that arena, that sector, all the time. First, we have Kevin Morley, who is the manager of federal relations with AWWA. That breaks out to the American Water Works Association. So they're kind of an industry trade group that works on water. You might think of them like EPRI and some of the others in electric. And then we also have Joel Cox with West Yost Associates, and I managed to spell Yost wrong. So if you're listening this, you won't know, but if you're watching the video, Yost is Y-O-S-T. So West Yost Associates. And Joel is the principal ICS cybersecurity engineer at West Yost Associates. So gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you, Dale.
Well, this is going to be a sector-specific talk, and I think it's maybe a good place to start on what makes water unique or what makes water different than a lot of the other sectors that we deal with in ICS. And I wrote down three, but there might be more. So let's at least hit the first one because I think it's one of the most important. And that is, I view water as slow in comparison to some of the other sectors. So, for example, canals tend to move slowly if you don't change gate positions. And in water treatment, you have to add a lot of chemicals to a reservoir or to a processing to make a difference. Whereas in electric, things can happen in milliseconds. But in water, things can take a much longer time to take place. Do you think that's a valid differentiator? And do you have any other examples where water might be slower than some of the other sectors? Maybe I'll start with you, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point in the comparison to, say, the electric sector, where there is that more kind of nanosecond relationship in terms of potential consequence. And, you know, as some incidents have shown, there are a series of consecutive controls, if you will, to use IT and OT speak. But the water sector subscribes to what we call a multi-barrier approach, right? Defense in depth, which we use all the time in cybersecurity language. In this case, it's about water quality, and so it's slow in the sense that there are progressive states where you can control the processes and deviate or make adjustments. So in that sense, it's slow. I suppose, compared to certain other working environments.
Well, and maybe I'll talk to Joel a little bit about, I'm also thinking of if I don't have the control system for a little bit of time, or if the control system is not operating with integrity for a period of time, if I can get it, and it probably varies by site, but if I can get control integrity within hours or something, it might not impact my customers at all. I'm sure it's a fire drill at the company if all of a sudden things are not working, but it's not to the point where you have to put boil water notices out and other things. You have some sort of time to deal with things. Is that what you find out in the field?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Dale. Probably, yeah. You do definitely have a little bit of time to assess the situation, maybe go into some sort of manual operations to keep the water flowing to the clients. The one scenario, though, I could think where it could be kind of a quick hit is if there was control of the water system. If the person was to slam a valve shut and turn on a pump at the same time, that would quickly create a kinetic impact of pipes bursting in the plant or in the street. So that would be the only scenario I could think where it would be a quick hit.
Yeah, and we might talk a little later about, some of the consequence type things. I know West Yost is a CCE player, and that might be something where consequence reduction prevents that as opposed to security control. So that's one. Another area I thought was a little different is just the number of companies involved, and it is very large. Like I don't know which was the right number. I saw a couple of numbers. I saw a number of 150,000 public water systems in the United States. And then I saw a number of 52,000 drinking water systems in the United States. Kevin, is there, is there a number that you have that AWWA uses? But it's a big number, whatever the number is.
It is. Scale is certainly, to the larger point here, scale is certainly something that's perhaps a little bit different than some of the other sectors. So when we talk about the total number, of water systems, there are three types, and that constitute the public water systems, which gets you to the 150, Dale. Within that, there's a subset of utilities, what you normally think of as your utility, that are called community water systems. Okay. That's your municipal and privately owned utilities that provide service in whatever city you might be in. That's roughly 52,000, right? So
Okay.
the remainder, the balance of that, let's just round it off, make the math easy. The other 100,000 are transient or non-transient community water systems. So that might be like, Joe's truck stop or the KOA campground or something like that. That's a little bit different in terms of the total numbers. We tend to statutorily focus on community water systems, which is what you traditionally look at.
Okay.
And then just to kind of round it out, right, we have our wastewater utilities. So that's about 16,000 wastewater facilities. Some of those are within the same organization, but that's another 16,000.
And it's interesting when you look at wastewater, we do see wastewater failures on scale probably more often than we see water failures on scale.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest cyber incident in the water sector was probably Marucci Shire back in 2000 down in Australia, which was a wastewater facility.
I'm not even talking about a cyber incident. I'm talking about incidents where, you get huge rainfalls and that overwhelms the wastewater system and they release a bunch of untreated waste. You hear about that almost every year in large metropolitan wastewater systems, whereas you don't hear a lot of, we now had Jackson, Mississippi, but we don't hear a lot of large municipal. I guess I shouldn't say that. We had that in Michigan as well, right? I guess there are some, but to me, I hear a lot more wastewater incidents than water.
Yeah, the difference is you can't really shut the wastewater off, right? Once it's coming down, it's coming down, and it's got to go somewhere. So it's going to come out at some place. Whereas in the drinking water side, there's a little bit more control in the delivery, right?
Okay, and then the last one I had, and then I'll throw it open to you, is that we have heard, there was a great paper, The Myth of the 85%, where you've heard the government over and over again say 85% of critical infrastructure is run by the private sector. And this paper showed that actually 85% of the population in the United States is served by a public sector water organization. Now, that could be municipal, or a larger government organization. And for example, in Florida, it was 92%. So it was actually the public sector has control for the most part for most of the people served in this country, which is unusual, and almost gets to me away from the finger pointing. They're always saying, hey, private sector, you need to do a better job. When we look at water sector, it's lagged some other sectors like oil and gas and electricity in paying attention. I think they've stepped up quite a bit in the last couple of years, but that's really something that's different. Joel, how about from your standpoint, is there anything else that you think sets water aside from the other sectors?
I think one area that we see more often is because of the smaller size of a lot of the utilities. It's much more of a challenge for them to implement some of the security controls that we may touch on during this discussion here. Whereas if you look at the other sectors, the oil and gas and the electric and those sectors, there seems to be a little bit more awareness, funding, support to put those types of things in. So I think that's one thing that's unique with water and wastewater.
Kevin, any other areas you think that are important differentiators for water?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you coming up, noting that the label of private sector. We, since the beginning of, HSPD 7 and Department of Homeland Security and the critical infrastructure designations, we've wrestled with that concept. And, you know, in reality, what that really is 85, in my perspective, at least 85% is non-federal, which puts it into the private domain. That and whereas we're almost the complete opposite of the electric sector, which is, let's just go with the 80-20 split between municipal, and truly private investor owned. And that's about the inverse of that in the water sector, where roughly 20% is either private not-for-profit or truly investor owned. The other point, just to come back to the scale thing real quick, Dale, that I meant to mention, is that, within that 42,000, roughly 11,000 serve more than 3,300 and are regulated under certain provisions of the Safe Drinking Water Act for security and preparedness and type things. But within that 52,000 community water system, 40,000 of those serve less than 10,000 people. So these are typically, get out your old Rand McNally, dating myself, right? All those little map dots all over the country are small communities. They usually have a water tower. And that's your water systems.
Is that 3,300 number for the company or for the facility?
That's the population served by the facility.
Okay.
So 11,000 serve 11. I'm sorry. Yeah, roughly 11,000 utilities serve 3,300 or more population served. The remainder, right, roughly 40,000 serve less than 3,300.
Yeah.
Those are really small systems. So when we get into the complexities and capacity issues of IT, OT security, that is one of the challenges that I suspect we'll chat about some more.
And it's funny because I don't know what kind of visibility we have. I know what kind of visibility I have. It's very little, except for personal experience. But looking from the outside, how many incidents are happening in those 41,000 that are very small? I mean, I had my own critical infrastructure experience here. There was a major rainstorm in Maui where I live and brought down all these trees and rocks that smashed a bunch of pipes. So we had no water for over a week and no drinkable water for over 2 months. And, that was a small story here because it only affected about 1,000 people. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But I wonder how many of those small systems have incidents on an annual basis and just take a long time to deal with things not related to cyber just because they don't have a lot of resources. Is that a big problem in the water sector, or is that something that is pretty rare?
I mean, we've actually post Katrina moved very efficiently to build out and develop a mutual aid networks amongst water utilities, Dale. Similar to the electric sector. So probably a lot of comparisons. The difference is we certainly don't have the frequency of deployment that they do because our stuff is underground, so it doesn't get ripped up as much. But had a major response to the floods in eastern Kentucky, which mainstream media is maybe going to cover it for a day, not going to hear about. But you had 20 plus utilities respond and stabilize utility operations in about 8 or 9 different utilities within those impacted towns. Huge difference. Major change in terms of recovery time relative to your point that you experienced there in Maui.
Well, and islands, I mean, as Puerto Rico is experiencing now
that's another
and
level
previously,
of complexity.
just very difficult to get that kind of support. Okay, well, let's shift now to the topic that I was thinking, why I wanted to get you on, because I had read something that I believe, Joel, your company was involved with related to SCADA in the cloud or ICS in the cloud. And certainly we know everything, quote, everything is moving to the cloud, but maybe not everything. But in the general T world, IT, OT, people talk about most things moving to the cloud. And we're aware of predictive maintenance moving to the cloud and efficiency studies moving to the cloud. But where it gets real interesting is when operations moves to the cloud, where you're actually, changing set points and monitoring things for call outs and such. To me, some of those factors that we heard about in water would seem to make water a good first best case for moving some of those operations to the cloud, particularly for the smaller asset owners who maybe don't have the staff to deal with this. If you were to characterize, Joel, where we are now in terms of SCADA operations or water operations in the cloud, where are we? Are we just super early adopters, the pioneers? Is more of this happening than we may know about? Where is the sector right now?
Yeah, good question, Dale. The areas that we focus in, mostly the West Coast of the U.S. here, there definitely is a lot of interest in it. The companies are popping up every day with these types of services. We don't know too many yet that have made the full transition to the cloud, but we have worked with some that have looked at cloud as a emergency response. So in certain processes in the water system, more so out in the distribution system, where something may happen, like you were talking about earlier, damaged piping or equipment or something like that, could we drop in SCADA in the box solution that allows them to address that emergency using cloud services? So that's where we've kind of seen it to start to pick up, but there's definitely a lot of interest in it, which is why we worked with AWWA on the article.
It would make sense to me. I've thought for a while that one of the great uses of the cloud, and this is not just for the water sector, would be, let's say I still want to have my on-site control room. That's my primary control room. But having a backup control room in the cloud seems like an easy win, because that can move around as necessary. That can be switched on like this. I haven't seen a lot of people switch it over to that yet, but I guess if we go to Kevin, what are you seeing in terms of use of the cloud right now? Are you seeing people use it for operations yet in SCADA?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some horror stories here too, but I would say, kind of bigger picture, Dale, to the point is, we're kind of at an interesting inflection point in terms of workforce challenges, technology advances, and pressures on what I would say cybersecurity risk management, right? That are going to force the issue, and in the sense that, just like, my car doesn't have a CD player or tape deck anymore, right? The technology that I purchased to run my facility isn't, I'm going to be forced to use certain platforms, and there's some trade-offs with that, right? And I think, you mentioned CCE. I think maintaining some capacity to have manual operation while also benefiting from the efficiencies of cloud services are something that, I think will challenge the concept of valued engineering, right? No offense to those folks, but taking away those switches doesn't necessarily help me out long term, as the Ukrainian power grid learned a few years back. But that I think is the challenge, and again, workforce compression is a factor in some entities moving in that direction. And I think, coming back to the smaller systems, why I think there are probably some important value propositions to moving to the cloud, in enabling them kind of jumping the shark, so to speak, into a more secure application environment, sort of like Office 365, right? If I don't keep, that kind of mentality, security as a service, I think there's some maturity that needs to come along with that, and understanding the risk trade-offs that I think get overlooked as some of the stuff is pushed. Joel can probably talk about that a little more detail for some of the projects he's been on, but I think that's part of the story here.
Well, Joel, you mentioned the small utilities.
Yep.
And and it's funny because they probably can't afford West Yost. They certainly can't afford me. Um, but I've visited some of them sometimes, where I've lived. I haven't done it here in Hawaii, but when I lived in Florida and in Utah and such, I'd know someone who was doing it. I'd say, oh, hey, let me go by. A lot of times I'd find the person responsible for the network infrastructure and the computers was also responsible for fixing the printers if they broke. There's always one VP who can't figure out how to use his laptop who's calling for support. There's always one executive like that. Literally, you're talking one or two people responsible for all of the T in the company, IT, OT, everything. To me, it's a myth that they think they have a reliable, under control OT environment. They just happen not to have had a problem yet there. So to me, I always thought that they would be a really good candidate for SCADA in the cloud, because also these smaller ones tend to have more of a manual capability. So the SCADA is almost or the SCADA or the ICS that's doing whatever process it's doing is usually there to help automate it and make their job easier. They're not as reliant on it as the larger ones. But I wonder then if the people that are providing these ICS and the cloud services are interested in those small utilities. I mean, they're not going to be able to pay a whole lot of money. If they could pay a whole lot of money, they'd have a staff. Do you see a business case for one of these companies to actually target the 41,000 that Kevin mentioned that are serving less than 3,300 people?
Yeah, I think there is, when you look at the volume side of that equation. We worked with a company, XIO, who's had some SCADA in the cloud services. We've worked closely with them, actually, and we can really see a nice fit with their services in that target you're referring to there, those small utilities. And it might be the good starting point to prove that these systems can be secure. They can provide that not only monitoring, but also the operational control of these systems in a secure way, and then build some trust and confidence, maybe, and as we go up to the medium size utilities, in starting to leverage some of that. We see even in wastewater a good use case for it, because when you think about wastewater, it's just lift stations scattered around the community to keep that moving. That's a very simple process. So having a SCADA in the cloud service monitoring those types of processes, I think, would be a good fit before maybe we get into a large, complicated water distribution processes.
Kevin, what do you think if we looked in a crystal ball a little bit, what type of utilities would be good candidates for ICS in the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of go back to one of your posts, I think it was over the summer, about the cyber poor, right? And so I think there's some economics that come along with some of these capabilities that are attractive, but whether or not ensuring that the utility can still kind of maintain those services longer term, I think that's part of the challenge. I do think that there is a case to be made for the smaller to medium systems and even the larger systems, but in that case, you're starting to get into a much more complex network configuration and everything. And not to say it's not applicable, but it may be easier to kind of get some functionality and get some baseline capability in place in these smaller systems, which, from a national perspective, that's the trade-off, right? Well, is this nationally significant? Well, I don't know, but maybe not. But it's pretty darn important to the people who live in that town. I can tell you that. So,
Well,
it's critical to them.
Yeah, it was funny when I wrote that article, I think, that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I got a response from, a private reply from one woman, and it says, it's easy for you to say it's not critical, because it's not your water. And I wrote her back, I have had this. I've lived through this, and I still would say it's not critical to the country that my community doesn't have water. Now, no one was dying here. They could truck some water up. You could drive 30 miles to a friend and take a shower if you needed. So it wasn't a disaster. Something like Jackson seems to be a lot more worrisome, where the scope is a lot bigger. It's a little harder to deal with that. I guess so. I had heard of XIO, and I did a little searching, and I saw a company called Metro Cloud that seemed to be doing this as well. I wonder, for the larger and medium-sized companies, are we seeing any appetite by the control system vendors themselves to take this on? Because that would seem to make more sense. If this company integrated and installed it, they would have a good feeling. I could see them being in a better position to do a credible job of offering these services. Joel, are you seeing anyone doing that or talking about doing that in the industry?
I'm trying to think, but yeah, the mainstream control vendors we deal with in water, they're talking about it. They're looking into it. What we are seeing, though, is the companies that are doing the SCADA in the cloud and the control cabinets, they're using control technology that isn't that kind of traditional style PLC. It's a soft PLC where you're programming everything with software versus hardware components that are dedicated to functions, which makes them more flexible, more cost effective. So we haven't really seen up to this point the companies that are doing it that are using the traditional control system hardware components, and those big vendors they definitely have an eye on this, and they're starting to do research and talk to Kevin and others on how could they approach this area.
Do you see, I'm thinking like in the electric sector, I've run into cases where GE is doing some boiler monitoring and limited control, where they will say, you'll send our data to us. Yes, we'll do predictive maintenance, and we're allowed to change these set points within these ranges to increase your efficiency. Kevin, are there parts of the water system that, I guess, lean more towards a hybrid model where some is done externally or a certain amount is outsourced and some is kept in-house?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so a couple different ways. So I think probably the area that's probably most within the sector that's most advanced in this space is probably within energy management, right? And optimization of, as water systems, water's heavy and we use a lot of power, but those energy management technologies do lend themselves to this sort of hybrid approach where there is some outside control. And we have found that utilities, even some of the larger systems, do outsource some of those operations to have support. Part of it is, again, the workforce issue, right? They can't afford to have a Dale or a Joel on staff, right? It's municipal government. So think about the salary ranges within municipal government, all very good paying jobs, but when it comes to this territory, it's kind of the Wild West, that they can jump off and work for some big tech company. It's going to be hard to keep somebody like that on a municipal team. I mean, that's kind of a segue, but
it's an important point.
Important piece of it. I do see the other piece of it, and I think Joel's probably seen this, and I'm sure you have too. In terms of just the overall data generated by utilities, I would say overall there's probably some limited optimization of all this data that's collected, and there's a lot of kind of activity associated with digital twins and just AI to kind of really understand what's going on with water quality in the utility and do some optimization on processes that probably lend themselves to the cloud environment just because of the computing power and stuff like that. So do see a lot of activity and discussion in that territory as well.
Yeah, that's kind of the no-brainer because Brian Owen of, I guess they're no longer OSI Soft, Viva. He always compared cloud services to open or closed loop. So he said, if you're sending things to the cloud and it's not sending back an operational command or a data point that you're making a command decision on, he called that open loop. And I think the business cases for open loop applications are huge. You mentioned some of them. It's the closed loop where, the risk goes up, and you have to make sure that risk benefit weighs, or calculation makes sense. Maybe let's shift now, because there are two other things I wanted to hit quickly while I had you on. The first was Oldsmar, which of course is everyone's favorite buzzword. You'll see it in every presentation for the next 20 years, just like we did with Marucci Schreier. But I'm curious. I had my own feelings about how the community, I guess I'm less worried about how the press reacted, but how the community and how the government reacted to Oldsmar, both in terms of how you think they reacted, and was it the appropriate reaction, or what did they really miss? What did people get wrong in all the discussions we're hearing about Oldsmar? Who wants to take that one first?
Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, we're going to have two different angles, I think, on this, Kevin. Yeah. My opinion is, I think while it was a good learning experience and brought attention to the importance of cybersecurity in the water sector, I think it was a little bit overblown in what technically happened, and how the system became exposed. And I think, to your point, Dale, the media, the way they communicated it to the media was maybe not the best way. It could have been a better way. But what it did do is we started to receive, as West Yost, a lot of calls, a lot of question, a lot of concern. It really brought attention to how these water utilities, and especially the smaller ones that we've been discussing, need to ask people that understand, technology. Is it good to just put TeamViewer on my operator workstation, right? Is it good to just plug this device into my network because the vendor said it was going to give me some sort of remote access or other functionality? So it definitely started good discussions and started people thinking about technology and changes to their environment before they are implementing things now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add on to that, Dale, that I think on the positive side, the incident did make the threat and the reality of the vulnerability to water systems tangible, right?
Yep.
There had been some other thing that's like, oh, that was some place down in Australia, it was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, obviously, I'm sure you're aware of incidents, and I am, but they don't, they're in some FBI database or something, so it's not out in the public domain for peer-to-peer kind of communication. And I think from a timing perspective, 2018, there were new provisions passed that required water utilities to do risk and resilience assessments that really expanded what had previously been required for, considering cyber threats. And so Oldsmar happened right before some of those compliance deadlines, and it really changed how utilities that were paying attention to things thought about the question. And that senior manager, the CEO, saying, "Hey, Joel, Dale, where are we at on this? Is this going to happen to me?" And so it did elevate it to what I would call the senior management or C-suite. And over the last decade, I can tell you that the conversation that I've had with utility managers has done a complete 180. Right before, it was very deferential. Oh, hey, my guy Joel says everything's good. We're not connected to the internet. Blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, today, now there's, with some of the awareness between us and CISA and EPA, there's a more, we're more able to have a more directed conversation on accountability, to be able to say, well, Joel, demonstrate to me that we're doing the things that are best practice, right? Are we all the way there yet? No, but we've made a lot of progress, in my opinion. So that would be the upside. The downside is, we're now kind of cast about as the worst sector of all critical infrastructure, which I'm not really sure that that's the case, but you know,
Well, I would put water similar to chemical in that
okay.
there are some large water utilities that are doing quite a good job
Mhm.
Oh
and
yeah.
have been working on it for more than 10 years.
Oh yeah.
And then there are a large number of small to medium that have done very little. Some have done some things, but haven't. And you see that in the chemical industry too. The big players most of them have been working on it, but then you'll find one big player that's kind of a laggard who has, not decided to go along. So yeah, I have seen a lot of progress in water, but it was funny with Oldsmar with me. I understand how this helped awareness. And maybe you don't worry about reality if the story is good. But to me, it showed that there needed a better media response. Like the incident response team, part of it is protecting reputational risk.
Yep.
Mhm.
And I've seen there was an incident in the UK recently where I thought they did a better job with dealing with reputational risk. And also, I guess, Joel, related to consequence.
Mhm.
I thought that this should have been a real wake up call for consequence
Mhm.
because in the end, as far as I understand it, even if this operator had not seen them moving things around and called it and disconnected some things, there was no way people were going to be harmed by having poisoned water delivered to their tap. There were many, many places in between where it would have stopped. So I would have
Mhm.
thought, that you'd take a mea culpa, our security needs to get better, but nobody was at risk and we were going to continue to deliver water. We don't rely on this system to prevent bad things, kind
Yep.
of an extension of the defense in depth, but not a cyber defense in depth, a human and other processes defense in depth and capabilities. I thought that it would have been a lot better if it could have done that, and it would have been a lot better if some of the people speaking to it would have highlighted that you
Yep.
need to make sure that you can still do your mission if your control system is corrupted, or at least that you won't harm people. Now, maybe you have a period where there's not drinkable water or there's some other thing, but it's not going to do it. And I guess maybe to turn this into a question, Joel, what are you're doing? West Yost is involved with INL's consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, CCE. What kind
Yes.
of pickup on reducing consequence, not the likelihood of high consequence events, but true consequence reduction are you seeing in the water sector?
Well, we're still early on, I think, in getting this new framework out and communicated. We've done several sessions with large water utilities to explain the concepts,
Mm-hmm.
and it's resonating. It's resonating with a lot of people. But surprisingly, we've even found a few larger utilities that they were doing some of those things unknowingly
Mm-hmm.
when they were engineering systems. Right, they were thinking about the things that were non technology, non cyber related, that could create those points in the process where things could be seen, could be addressed, could be, slow it down even more than it already is to contain things. So right now, we're starting to see it pick up as we educate the water sector. We've had that great privilege working with INL and being, certified to push this out in the water sector, working with Kevin as well. I think we did it, and I'll throw XIO out there again. We had a client that wanted to use an XIO product. We
Mm-hmm.
worked with XIO and did a quick CCE process on it. We didn't do the whole rigorous
Mm-hmm.
program, but parts of it. And they adjusted their design and their engineering in that box to eliminate a consequence that we thought would be, pretty serious for the client.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one area we've actually applied it, been able to adjust the solution and improve the output of it.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. I mean, I hope we get more of that. And a lot of times, as you say, there's things in place that are designed for non-cyber consequence reduction
Yes.
methods.
Yes.
What we've seen in other industries is sometimes as things are updated, those get removed
Hmm.
because they're replaced. And I think people maybe thinking twice before saying, "Hey, this manual control that is being replaced by this PLC out there, maybe we should keep it here,
Agree.
just in case we might need it sometime."
Yeah.
Okay, last topic, Kevin. This one's for you, and Joel. You're happy to comment on it, but Kevin, you were in front of Congress testifying about the water sector, as AWWA is known to do from time to time. And one of the things you put in your testimony, and I've seen an AWWA publication on this, was encouraging the government to put something in place similar to NERC CIP for the electric sector, where there is a third party that is responsible for creating the standards and auditing to the standards and reporting up to the EPA or some other government organization. And I must admit, this was kind of a joke in the community that has been involved with NERC CIP, and all of us were like, no, do anything but that. Do not do NERC CIP. So maybe explain to me why you think this is a good idea and why it would be better than the long journey we've been on for NERC CIP.
Well, it's not. I would just slight amendment, friendly amendment.
Sure.
It's not NERC CIP. It's not take NERC CIP and put it out of water. Okay.
Okay.
So I'll background this. So this does tie into Oldsmar,
Mm-hmm.
right? And certainly also related to Colonial Pipeline situation, right? And you've been around long enough. What we observe with our federal partners is that when there's a crisis, suddenly there's a lot of top-down imposed solutions, and
Mm-hmm.
and unfortunately, my friends in the pipeline sector
Yeah.
have felt the burden of some really prescriptive top-down, not risk-based um, um, actions that they are required to do as a result of the colonial incident. And so, when in that period of time, I said, "Hey, look, obviously, we've got some things in place now that require utilities to assess this, but they're not prescriptive, and
Mm-hmm.
that's important. Just given our discussion on scale, right? There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
diversity in the sector, and so as we thought about it, it was like, okay, what is a workable solution here, right? To have a shared responsibility, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
hammering water utilities is not the way to get this done. It needs to be a partnership with our federal partners. And so the thought process was looking around. We looked at the electric sector and said, you know what? They've got this, what I'll call public-private partnership with the NERC FERC model.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a FERC in the water sector, and we don't exactly have a NERC, but the
Mm-hmm.
concept of the decision process is really what we were focused on, Dale. And uh, we prepared a white paper with Paul Stockton, who's been around for a while on cyber issues, and really examined how to set this up in the water sector. And it was actually ended up being picked up by the Solarium Commission report that was developed by FDD, uh, which we were happy to see. Certainly requires some legislative authorities, but the central goal there is to have the owner operators in a decision role in defining the what. Same way as they are with NERC in establishing what those requirements would be, which for those in their case became NERC CIP. Um, I think you know from our perspective, it requires a tiered and scalable approach, recognizing the differences in maturity, the size of the
Mm-hmm.
systems that we talked about. And, the utilities would pay into the process to facilitate a periodic audit process, which provides for accountability, The market is interested in that, whether it's the rating agencies or insurance underwriters. And more importantly, it really reduces the burden on our state partners, which really don't have the technical capacity nor the workforce to get into the mechanics of, hey, Dale, demonstrate to me that you've implemented MFA through your
Mhm.
entire water utility operation. That's a really intrusive process if it's a state regulator. Now that information goes into the public domain, it just we believe that this eliminates some of those problems and reaches the end goal that we all share to move cybersecurity forward in the water sector. So we're hopeful that a legislative package gets moved forward. Obviously, we're hitting into some funky time with midterms, so not
Yep.
sure that'll happen this year. But there's certainly some model legislation there to kind of move this forward if we can get around to it in 2023.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that's really a challenge for any regulation, and they're dealing with this in Singapore. I was there, and they've put
Mm.
out some regulations recently, is prescriptive regulations that say you must do this are the direction they tend to go if they're going to be audited, just because it's
Hmm.
hard to audit anything that's risk-based.
Hmm.
But then if you talk to any of the security professionals, they say, no, that's the wrong way to do it. It should be risk-based. This security control that might be on your list might actually not do anything or almost nothing to reduce risk. And now you're just making me do a bunch of things for compliance that are really not addressing risk. And that's one of the things that, NERC CIP just got crazy with having to auditors go in and checking every port,
Yeah.
and every server run. I mean, it just got absurd, the amount of expenditure for the amount of risk reduction it achieved. It did achieve some, but it didn't do others. I don't think the structure you're talking about is a bad idea. The idea that you have some third party with asset
Hmm.
owner involvement doing it, but then actually what they create, that was always the problem with NERC CIP. It wasn't so much the structure, it was those standards themselves that started out being one way and then just audit moved them more and more and more to this prescriptive, do this whether it makes sense or not mode. Do you have any idea how you'd avoid that trap?
Well, I think we've already sort of taken a run at it, Dale, with the guidance that we developed after actually in parallel within this cybersecurity framework back in 2014. We were already moving in the direction to develop guidance for the sector, and then as the CFS project moved forward, we said, hey, well, let's just mirror this. And we created this sector specific, really flips the whole paradigm on its head. And it really, what it does is to kind of sort out kind of just doing things for the sake of doing things. We ask a set of questions that are technology based, like, no sense having you do controls if you don't have a technology that it applies to. And so we've
Mm,
prioritized the NIST controls relevant to the technologies applied in the utility. It is it 100%? Probably not, but it provides a really solid foundation for scaling what's most prudent and applicable to your system. And if somebody's got a different prioritization scheme, I'm all ears. But we think it's pretty solid, and it may provide a really good foundation for what we're describing here, and so that you can, you know, establish some minimum floor
mhm.
and then scale relative to the complexity of the utility.
Well, it's a hard problem. I mean,
It
I
is.
don't. I finally wrote an article on what I would do if I was king in terms of regulation, but it took me about 15 years to figure it out. I mean, I literally I had no idea. I finally think I figured out what I would do, but even that probably would have problems. So as we finish up here, Joel, is there anything else that you think? Obviously, the water sector knows what the water sector is doing, but I'm dealing with a lot of ICS security professionals here that are watching that deal with a lot of sectors. Is there any other issue or guidance you'd want to bring up for the water sector specifically?
That's a good question, Dale. So
Well, the answer can be no. We could have covered it all,
Yeah.
or maybe it's all the same. But or we can go to Kevin if Kevin had any last word. I guess these are kind of last words. If you had any
Last
last
words.
words for
Yeah.
the audience.
Yeah, I think what we really want to see, and what Kevin's trying to get at with what he just described, is um, creating more accountability, within these water utilities to give attention and funding and resources to cybersecurity, but do it at the rate that's appropriate for the size of the utility.
Hmm.
And then also start to look at these non-technology engineering controls that oftentimes they're much more comfortable with. They understand those more, that will reduce the consequence and the risk in that size of that environment that they're working in.
Okay, Kevin, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, CIS is about to put out their performance goals, and we've reviewed those, and I think the guidance that we've developed lays up fairly well against some of that activity, um, and I just think there needs to be a healthy recognition, coming back to one of your starting points about the profile of the sector, recognizing that these are municipal governments. So the procurement processes, right? These aren't billion-dollar, capitalized companies on the market, right? They're municipal
Mhm.
government, and so the procurement process and turning the ship around in the harbor, so to speak, takes a little bit of time. So there's a lot of new shiny pennies that various agencies are chasing after. We need to start with basic fundamental cyber hygiene and some of the services offered by CISA, and just and building that capacity and facilitating the implementation, right? Just jamming more lists down people's throat isn't going to get it done. But there needs to be facilitated support to help with implementation. That's the biggest gap, and we're hopeful that we can get there.
Well, great. Well, I appreciate you taking this journey into the water sector with us. My guests this time have been Kevin Morley, Manager Federal Relations with AWWA, and Joel Cox with West Yost, YOST. He's a Principal ICS Cybersecurity Engineer. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on the show.
Thank you,
You
Dale.
bet. Thanks,
Appreciate
Dale.
the time.